It was September 2018. Brother and sister Yoshika and Takehiro entered a North Yorkshire chemist's and bought 2 large bottles of surgical spirit. They'd been in several times already this week, each time buying 2 bottles of the spirit. What did they need it for? The chemist was beginning to get suspicious. She became even more suspicious when she approached the siblings and noticed the unmistakable stench of death upon them. Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here, and today we're looking at the strange death of Rina Yasutake. The Yasutake family were a reclusive bunch. There was Michiko Yasutake, her daughters Yoshika and Rina, and her son Takehiro. They lived together in a small house in the picturesque town of Helmsley, North Yorkshire. They'd first moved to the UK from Japan when Michiko married a British man. When the marriage failed in 1998, the Yoshika family had moved into the Helmsley house and cut themselves off from the outside world. They had no TV, radio or telephone, and they rarely interacted with their neighbours. Rina was a little more outgoing. She received private education at Queen Mary's School and was known as a fun-loving and popular student. In 1986, she won a scholarship to Cambridge, and there she studied classics, specialising in linguistics. Again, at Cambridge, she was known as an outgoing and friendly young woman. However, after graduating from Cambridge, she moved back to her family's home and soon broke contact with her former friends, becoming insular and reclusive along with the rest of her family. Most people in the town where she lived didn't even know that she existed. Newspapers say that she was a talented artist and even sold a few of her pieces, but sadly I've been unable to find any examples of her work. Not much is known about her life after Cambridge, except that something happened to cause her mental health to severely decline. Perhaps it was simply the insular lifestyle in their Helmsley home. In 2013, she visited a doctor requesting psychiatric help. She was experiencing violent mood swings and was afraid that she was going to attack her family members. She received some counselling but wasn't seen again after that. In 2018, Rina's father, who still lived in Japan, died and Rina fell into a deep depression. She started to eat less and less and only drank occasionally. Over the following weeks, Rina grew increasingly weak, eventually becoming too frail to leave her bed. The family, due to their insular nature, were afraid that something would happen if they took her to hospital, and although they tried to encourage her to eat something, they decided that Rina had chosen her own path and they allowed her to slowly starve. On the 18th of August, Rina finally succumbed. She passed away quietly in her bed. And here's where things start to get strange. Her family refused to believe that she was actually dead. Her body remained in the bed and her brother and sister continued to care for her corpse as if she was actually alive. In a later interview with a psychiatrist, her sister would say, "She was still breathing, her body was warm and she still had a pulse. She did not say much to us, so we said to eat and drink more. She looked like she was nourished by eating her soul. I don't know how to explain. Even though she wasn't eating, she was nourished with spiritual food and she was fulfilled." And so her body remained in her bed for a number of weeks, the family treating Rina as if she was living. Even when her corpse began to rot and stink, they still believed that she was alive. Towards the end of September, the decay must have become unbearable because this is when they started visiting the chemist and buying large quantities of surgical spirits. A lot of articles say that the family embalmed Rina's body, but none of these sources provide any further details, at least not that I can find. Did they go through the whole gruesome ordeal of draining her body of fluids and replacing it with some sort of preservative? Did they just inject surgical spirit into her body in a crude attempt to preserve it? It seems unlikely, but it is possible. It would be odd behaviour for people who still believed that Rina was alive. It could be something similar to this case from India, where in 2021 a man named Vimlesh died in his home, but his family refused to believe it, and so they kept his corpse in the house thinking he was just in a coma, and when he started to decay, they started washing him with cleaning chemicals. The cleaning chemicals stopped the bacteria growing on his skin and slowed down the putrefaction process, so neighbours were never alerted by the smell of his decomposing body. The family kept this up for 18 months before they were discovered. When Vimlesh's body was found, the skin had turned black and he was partially mummified. Rina's body was also described as partially mummified. Perhaps her family were simply cleaning her skin with the surgical spirits, slowly pickling her corpse from the outside. Either way, as I said at the beginning of the video, the large quantities of surgical spirit that they were buying and the fact that they smelled like death made the staff at the chemist's a little bit suspicious. On the 25th of September, when Yoshika and Takehiro attempted to buy another 2 bottles, the chemist, Eva Ward, confronted them. She noticed that Takehiro was carrying a pink folder containing some letters, and she spotted Rina's name written on a piece of paper inside the folder. She pointed to the paper and asked if the surgical spirit was for her. Takehiro nodded and said, "Our sister is unconscious." Now, I've heard 2 different accounts on how the police were actually alerted. Most news reports say that the chemist rang the police and tipped them off, but this article in the Times says that builders were repairing the roof of the Yasutake house and they noticed the smell of a decaying corpse coming from inside, and so they called the police. Most photos of the house from the time when they discovered Rina's body do show scaffolding up. Maybe both these things happened at the same time. The chemist and the roofers called the police, and the combination of calls were enough to alert the police to the property. To be honest, I'm surprised the body wasn't discovered sooner. When I first heard this story, I assumed the family lived in some isolated cottage in the middle of nowhere, but looking up the house on Street View, they live on quite a busy street with neighbours on both sides. Anyway, however they were alerted, on the 25th of September, police visited the property in Helmsley, and in an upstairs bedroom they found Rina's body. She was lying on a mattress on the floor with a duvet drawn up to her neck. A paramedic named Karen Tomlinson was on the scene, and she said, "It was obvious that she'd been dead, and probably had been for some weeks." The weird thing is, as if this case wasn't strange enough already, even after Rina's body was taken away and the family were told that she was dead, they still refused to believe it and continued to claim that Rina was alive. They believed this for several more months until a psychologist could convince them otherwise. Rina's body was so badly decomposed that it was impossible for a coroner to determine a cause of death, but they found no signs of injury or poisoning. The Yasutake family were charged with preventing a lawful and decent burial, but the prosecution was eventually halted. It was decided that pursuing the case would not be in the public interests, as the family were found to be suffering from an extremely rare mental disorder. None of the sources I found say what mental disorder that is, and I've been wondering what it could be that they were suffering from. Folie à trois, perhaps, an even rarer condition than folie à deux. This is a condition in which multiple people can become afflicted with the same delusion simultaneously. Or maybe there's some kind of reverse Cotard syndrome, where instead of a living person believing that they're dead, a corpse is believed to be living. If there's any psychologist watching, perhaps they can enlighten me on this, because I'd be interested to know what mental condition they were actually diagnosed with. So with the case halted, the family were free to go back to their reclusive, insular lives, and that's pretty much where we find things today. It's a sad case, but surprisingly not all that unusual. I've already covered another case where people were living with a dead body, but there are many more examples. It's a lot more common than you think. In the UK alone, I found a couple of similar cases in recent history. In 2014, another reclusive family. 59-year-old Timothy Brown and Kenneth, his 94-year-old father, lived in a small house in Stafford. One day, Kenneth had a fall, and after sitting down in an armchair in the living room, he died. Instead of calling the authorities, Timothy Brown left the body where it was and lived with his father's corpse for 4 months. It was only discovered when a neighbour popped by to check in on them and spotted Kenneth's skeletal remains sitting in the armchair. Timothy wasn't under the delusion that his father was still alive. It seems he just had trouble accepting the death and he didn't really know what to do. Another case from 2011, a 29-year-old man named Christopher Blackburn kept his father's dead body in his house, leaving it lying in a bed for 5 months. He even told his 10-year-old daughter that her grandfather was just sleeping. Neighbours would ask after his father and Christopher would tell them that he was fine, but after 5 months of not seeing him, the neighbours got suspicious and they called the police out of concern. In this case, it seems that Christopher did it purely so that he could claim his father's benefit checks for himself. He pocketed around £1,800 in total. Now, I know that isn't exactly small change, but it doesn't seem worth living with a corpse for 5 months just to get it. It makes me wonder how many more cases there are that we just don't hear about. I know that corpses can often go undiscovered when people are living alone and they pass away, but to have someone else living in the house with the body, it just adds a whole new level of creepiness to it. For someone to be able to bypass that natural repulsion we have towards corpses, especially when they start to putrefy, I find it unimaginable how somebody could live that way. The case of Rina Yasutake is an eerie one. It seems the family were genuinely gripped by a shared delusion that she was still alive. To me, their biggest crime wasn't preventing a lawful and decent burial, but for not seeking help while she was starving herself to death. Perhaps this was part of their delusion. I've heard some rumours that Rina's death was some sort of religious ordeal. The family were devout Buddhists, and people who shared a dorm with Rina at Cambridge said that she would get up at 5 AM every morning and do Buddhist prayer in the library. There is a very rare Buddhist practice in Japan called Shokusin-butsu. Probably butchering that. Buddhist monks will literally mummify themselves whilst they're still alive by slowly starving themselves to death. Practitioners believe that these monks are actually still alive and experiencing a deep spiritual state known as tukdam. For this reason, their corpses are preserved and revered, often displayed sitting in the lotus position for centuries on end. I've got no evidence that Rina's death was an act of Sokushinbutsu. The fact that her sister talked about Rina being nourished by eating her soul does lend a strange spiritual aspect to her death, but other than that, I can't find anything to support the idea. It seems most likely that she just fell into a deep depression and wasted away, surrounded by a family who were too scared to get help from the outside world. So there we have it, the strange death of Rina Yasutake. It's a sad story, but hopefully you found it interesting. A big thanks to those of you supporting the channel. I've started uploading some Patreon exclusive videos. They're not like my videos on this channel, they're more of a sort of vlog type of thing. At the moment I'm trying something out where I basically just paint on a canvas for an hour and see what comes out. It's nothing too amazing, but if you want to listen to me ramble about stuff whilst I paint stupid pictures, then you can check out my Patreon for that. Alright, here's some more videos you might enjoy. I've got a whole playlist of strange death videos if that interests you. It should be on the screen now, check that out if you feel like it. Thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.